Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining us for the final session of the workshop on Enhancing Responsible Business in Southeast Asia. This webinar series is jointly organized by the ISEAS-SPF Institute and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. First, before we begin, please allow me to share some housekeeping issues. The Chatham House rule applies to this webinar. To post questions, please use the Q&A function. Do identify yourself. Please share your name and institutional affiliation. To raise any technical problems, please use the chat function. We will now begin the webinar on the future of responsible business in Southeast Asia. This webinar will be moderated by Dr. Benjamin Low. Dr. Low, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Benjamin, and on behalf of ISEAS-SPF Institute and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, I would like to welcome all of you to this final installment of our webinar series on enhancing responsible business in Southeast Asia. Over the past 5 weeks, we have been talking about the impacts of business activities on Southeast Asia's individuals, communities, and the environment, and what responsible business practices and social investments can look like in normal times and during a crisis like COVID-19. Various topics were discussed, including how companies should engage with Southeast Asia's labor force. We also looked at migrant labor in more developed economies and how their social protection can be reinforced. We also covered other topics such as fighting inequalities by sustainable finance and how businesses can engage in environmental protection. And this morning, we will turn to the topic of the future of responsible business in Southeast Asia. We will discuss how governments, businesses, NGOs, and other stakeholders can respond to the challenges facing responsible business and what will be needed to prepare for a post-COVID future that can truly benefit disadvantaged individuals, societies, and the environment. We believe that such a future can help pave the way for a healthy business environment that in turn will lead to sustainable and inclusive economic growth. So we have with us a panel of very distinguished and well-qualified speakers to address this future. We have with us Dr. Yang Mi-Eng. She is the Executive Director of the ASEAN Foundation, and she leads the Foundation's efforts to promote ASEAN awareness and identity, as well as interaction with and development of the people of ASEAN. She has worked in the private and government sectors for over 26 years, with vast experience with the creative content industry, games publishing, as well as in the blockchain technology industry. And she will speak to us about ASEAN's role in enhancing responsible business. We are also fortunate to have with us Mr. Thomas. He is the CEO of the ASEAN Corporate Social Responsibility Network, which was established to promote and enable responsible business conduct in ASEAN member states. Mr. Thomas has extensive experience in corporate social responsibility, and he has served on various initiatives in the region and globally, including the development of standards and guidances. He was involved with the trade unions and cooperatives, and he had also served as a nominated member of parliament in Singapore. So Mr. Thomas will speak to us about working with governments, businesses, and civil society organizations on responsible business in the post-pandemic business world. Next, we have Ms. Miwa Yamada. She is Director of the Law and Institution Studies Group at the Institute of Developing Economies of the Singapore External Trade Organization, JETRO. She was previously with a business law firm, and her current research interests include human trafficking, human rights due diligence in supply chains, with a focus on migrant workers in Japan and Asian countries. Her research interest also covers the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in practice. She will speak to us on the opportunities and challenges in engaging with Japanese companies on responsible business in Southeast Asia. Our fourth speaker is Mr. Lowell Chow. He is the East Asia Senior Researcher and representative of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, where he is responsible for research and outreach in the region. His center is an online information hub that covers positive and negative impacts by over 9,000 companies worldwide, including a portal on the impacts of Chinese investment overseas. Mr. Chow holds a master's degree in corporate social responsibility from the Nottingham, and he will be speaking about the opportunities and challenges in engaging with Chinese companies on responsible business. And last, but certainly not the least, we are privileged to have Mr. Hirokazu Kobayashi to be with us. Mr. Kobayashi is the Executive Director of JETRO Singapore and also Special Advisor to the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI, in Japan. He is engaged in the promotion of Japan's economic cooperation in ASEAN and across the Indo-Pacific region. His portfolio at METI has included Japan-US trade policy, WTO trade negotiation, and international cooperation on climate change. He will speak about the role of responsible business in realizing transitions and innovation towards decarbonization in Southeast Asia. Our 5 speakers have been encouraged to limit their presentations to 5 minutes, which is itself a challenge given their collective wealth of knowledge and opinions on the subject. And there will be a panel discussion after that with an opportunity for our audience on the World Wide Web to ask questions. So I shall now hand over the time to our first speaker, Dr. Yang. Dr. Yang, the floor is yours, please.
Okay. So my sharing today, because of the time, so as what Ben was mentioning, 5 minutes. I think, all right, sorry. So, okay, most of you, maybe just for the benefits of all, maybe you'll be wondering what is ASEAN Foundation. ASEAN Foundation is actually an ASEAN body. We are ASEAN Charter, and we look after the 10 ASEAN member states. And we focus very much on youth from 15 to 34 years old. And you can see that our function is actually to build greater awareness of ASEAN and instill stronger ASEAN identity, and also provide platform for future-ready skills for our youth. So on top, you can see there are 4 cycles there. First is actually art and cultures, and then education, community development, and media is our focus. Why is ASEAN and why it matters? And then if we are actually a country, let's say we are the 7th largest economy in the world, and then ASEAN has the world's 3rd largest labor force behind China and India. There is a wake-up call, of course, everyone is aware of that, to actually have more inclusive actions and also sustainable growth for the following the SDGs platforms. So we actually wanted to create, we calling all the private and also government sectors collaborations to actually, it is more now needed for this, because from the impact survey done by ASEAN Secretariat, actually, the most challenging part of these SDGs, among all the SDGs, 15 and 17 has been actually not really been moving fast enough. The 17 is actually collaborations. So when we talk about CSR and all that, we talk about collaborations also. So COVID-19 also has revealed an unequal access to public services, especially the health side. Yeah? Apart from education, everything is stunted. And then from the impact of the Secretariat, ASEAN Secretariat survey, 90% of kids, youth and kids cannot go to school, affected their education. So all of this actually has an impact, long-term and short-term impact. That's why under the ASEAN, we have to look into different kinds of approach for short-term and long-term plan, not only for short-term. So we are also looking at sustainable kind of approach. So thanks to the internet, of course, public is more well-informed now than ever, but also there is a danger of overload of information, because everyone is now doing everything online, including what we are having today. So this is also, I just want to pledge some corporate or CSR. This is actually a job of Dr. Thomas, Mr. Thomas also. So to actually come forward now, it is your right time to brand your company as a very responsible company, that agile and also adaptable and looking at the interests of the people. So there is a window of opportunity for private sectors to step forward and work with government or CSO or people, public. What is the action? I will not do a big sharing in the sense of the whole ASEAN, because the whole ASEAN, we have many activities and many things has been done. But I will just zoom into what ASEAN Foundation has been doing, because ASEAN Foundation mandate is actually to do people-to-people connections, to take care of the people. But of course, we zoom in a lot to youth. So what we have been doing is to accelerate digital transformation. And thankfully that we have already been preparing this for the past few years. Our programs have channeled into future ready skill. So if you are looking at the left box, ASEAN Future Ready, you can even go to the platform. This is actually our few partnerships program with corporate and also with government initiatives. So our working partners is not only private corporate, but we also work together with other countries like our dialogue partners and all that, and also 10 dialogue partners and also the 3 dialogue partners. You can see the ASEAN Future Ready ASEAN is actually a partnership with Microsoft, and then Connect ASEAN is actually with Korean government, ROC, and then ASEAN Data Science Explorer is actually with SAP. So we have different kinds of business working collaborations. So these are all to the left button. The left section is actually to transform every business and every courses and learning into digital mode. We used to have face-to-face on the ground, but because of COVID-19, it really affected us, and we turned 80% of programs online right now. And also thanks to our partners, even corporate, they are very receptive, and they are supportive enough to agree into this kind of approach. So community building and COVID-19 support. We also work with philanthropies, United Ways for ASEAN Cares. So this is actually to feed the poor people and also to promote hygiene around ASEAN country. But for now, we are starting with Malaysia, Thailand, and also Myanmar. So empowering youth is actually our partnership with Maybank Foundation. So this has been going on very strong, and we wanted to actually create more projects in community-based project for social development purpose. So the last one is connecting youth with top ASEAN officials. We also build leadership in terms of young people. We give them some skill so that they can actually drive the social volunteering world and social development for the future. So we have ASEAN Science and Technology Fellowships, created more than 70 over fellows right now, and place them in the Ministry of Science and Technology in each country, and they do policy strategy recommendation, also go to the ground. And we also have ASEAN Foundation Leadership Program, which has been there for the past 6 years. So we did it all now in online. So we also wanted to building resilience through inclusive approach, because some of our programs like Future Ready ASEAN and all that touches on equality for women. To more than 51% of the participants is actually women, girls. And then we also wanted to harness public-private partnerships and collaboration, and we work now a lot with CSO. So later on, we discuss further on that. Then why youth? For us, youth is actually majority of population in ASEAN. 61% of them is youth in ASEAN, and there are 383 million people under the age of 35. So ASEAN region is a very young region. So why? Because they are full of energy and they are very IT savvy. I think most of the youth never complain about digitalization. I think the one that complaining is more like people like my age and my group. So it's complaining about adapting to the new digital world, virtual world. So for the young people, they are just getting used. They are born in that kind of millennium kind of generation. So for them, it's no issues. So, but the only problems now is infrastructure and also digital divide that we are talking about. So these are some of the way that we actually encourage youth to speak out and involve them in a lot of activity in terms of policy discussions, debates, and then also promote social enterprise. We have few new programs that I mentioned just now. It's in the finalized agreement with our partners, corporate partners, to actually bridge the gap of jobs. Because now we have a lot of issues on employment issues, especially when ASEAN has 61% youth. So you can imagine when they come out from the school and they finish their study, where are they going to work? So all these things are big issues. And then this is ASEAN challenges and the way forward to overcome the COVID-19. We wanted to urge, to pledge for everyone to actually stay united, because there are many impacts that created by COVID-19, which is demographic changes, uneven social development, technology adoption, digital and infrastructure divide issues, and the environmental degradation and disparity in economic development. That's why the SDGs itself, I think, is kind of very tough right now. So perhaps there is time that we need to actually relook into SDGs now, and then maybe perhaps do some adjustment on prioritize it, because 18 is too big, the number to focus everything. Yeah? So I think that most people are trying to target a lot of things now, and we might actually lose our focus. So we have to actually prioritize at this moment. That is the biggest challenge. Yeah? So thank you very much. This is my sharing. I'll pass it back to Ben. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yang, for ASEAN Foundation's efforts and programs during this time to address the challenges of COVID-19. And in particular, I'm very interested in exploring with you much later during the panel discussion on the role of the youth, as well as you were also mentioning about collaboration as being a challenge. I think it is something that we can also talk about later. So thank you, Dr. Yang. Now we move on to Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas, the floor is yours. You need to unmute yourself.
I'm just going to, just give me a second. Okay. I will just touch on 3 levels. What is really, because we're talking about governments, businesses, and CSOs, that the aspirations of ASEAN and what is really the reality and how do we address the way going forward. The corporate social responsibility, okay, this agenda came up in 2009 ASEAN Blueprint, where there was a component of CSR to be incorporated into the corporate agenda, contributing to sustainable socio-economic development. And as part of it, the driver behind this was the ASEAN Foundation. And I was involved in some of the discussions. And their idea at first was CSR for philanthropy and development. And we came in that it should not be on promoting by giving money at the end of it, but how businesses do it. So this was it. As a result of this blueprint, the ASEAN Foundation gave birth to the ASEAN CSR Network. We were formed in December 8th, 2010. We had funding from the Japanese government to start off. And today we are also an ASEAN entity under the ASEAN Charter. And the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, we are the responsible and inclusive business sector champion, with the objective of promoting, making a responsible business a community that makes ASEAN a better place for all to live. We had a few things that going on. Immediately after that, the ASEAN we did a few things, and one of the projects that we did was one of the first drivers to promote, do a baseline study on the nexus between corporate social responsibility and human rights. This was, I was the lead writer with Alexander Chandra, and this was a project of the ASEAN Intergovernment Commission on Human Rights. So in 2014 June, we presented this as the first thematic study. Part of it showed that actually all ASEAN countries have some good laws, but never implemented. And businesses are still thinking of CSR and corporate responsible business and philanthropy and charity for goodwill and publicity rather than treating people fairly and decently. Governments, we said, were still figuring out. The governments were quite blur. They were trying to find out what they do. So, but what happened was after this, when the ASEAN Forging Ahead document came out, human rights, responsible business was clearly in the agenda. So in the preamble, they talk about to realize rule-based, people-oriented, people-centered ASEAN community where people enjoy human rights, fundamental freedoms, quality of life, and things. But also, I want to say that in all the three community pillars master plan had responsible business conduct issues covered by all three pillars. They talk about human rights was covered, and sense of corporate social responsibility under the political security pillar. They talk about corruption, anti-integrity. In the economic pillar, we talked about social dialogue. Stakeholder engagement, sustainable economic development, good governance. The socio-cultural talked about decent work, private-public partnerships, the sustainable consumption, production. These are all issues that come up. One of the achievements, we would say, was in 2016, the ASEAN came out with these guidelines on corporate social responsibility on labor. This was adopted by unanimously all the 10 ASEAN countries, labor ministers in May 2016. What is interesting is initiated, the ASEAN CSR network was involved, the ILO was involved, but it was initiated by the Thai government Ministry of Labor when Thailand was facing some problems with the yellow card on their human rights things. So this had huge tripartite representation, government, business, trade unions were all involved in drafting this. And it is up to international standards with no provisions for misbehavior or not following the code, but it's still not socialized. The other one that we achievement, which we have done, sorry, I should put this. Okay, sorry, was the regional strategy on corporate social responsibility and human rights. This was in November 2016, and it was in Singapore. And this guidance actually had trade unions, CSOs, businesses, states, and we actually came out with the guidelines on the responsibility of all these parties on how to move corporate social responsibility and human rights. We think that businesses should take a holistic approach, just like the OECD due diligence on responsible business. When you take a holistic approach and embed responsible business and corporate social responsibility within your organization, you'll address human rights, will definitely be addressed more than a PR, but in reality. But what is the reality that we're talking about? The reality is that we did a study with the Mahidol University last year, and it came out very clearly that the human rights disclosure, this is just disclosure, not just practice. We believe that you do what you do, you will report, is falls substantially below. If we took the top 5 countries, top 50 top companies in this, you find that in terms of things, Thailand was the best above average, Malaysia, followed by Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, and Philippines. This is the ranking. But if you look at real issues of all the elements of it, we are far short. Okay, and this is. But if you look at real issues, the issues on forced labor, human trafficking, are much less reported than, say, environment and other things. So I also want to say that this is also related to, also reinforced by these studies that we have done with the National University of Singapore on sustainability reporting in ASEAN, where we cover 5 countries. we find that the issues that's most discussed are economic value generation, profits, how to make profits, philanthropy, health and safety, because there are laws on health and safety and push. But the least discussed issues were the economic impact of climate change, biodiversity, and human rights. So the human rights is the least reported topic about it. So what is the way forward? In 2018, together with the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, for which we were the things, we made a series of recommendations to the economic ministers when under Singapore's chairmanship of ASEAN. We basically said, look, here, there are issues that we have raised over the years, can we do something about it? So I made the list there. And we suggested that we should have a code for inclusive, resilient, sustainable growth, which is things, have a campaign, promote this, research, capacity building dialogues. Well, we moved on from this endorsement, and part of the achievements of this outcome was that now we have the economic pillar of ASEAN coordinating corporate social responsible business across as a focal point. We came up with this concept called the ASEAN Responsible Inclusive Business Alliance. This is based on a code that we ask businesses to subscribe to values and principles. Because when you do anything, you should have the right principles of accountability, transparency, ethical behavior, stakeholder engagement, respect for rule of law, respect for international norms, and to treat people with respect, dignity, and fairness. And we also said we should cover about 7 subject areas. The most important one is governance. If you don't have governance, you can't implement, you can't do anything. And in terms of governance, then also environment, labor, anti-corruption, human rights, consumer protection, and things. This is codification of all global standards, or what is most important. So we ask companies who subscribe to these values to like Dr. Young said, to join these things. So we are doing a slow start. In the past, we used to approach big companies, but now we are asking you to do just 6 things to realize this vision, to enable responsible business conduct in ASEAN, to promote a culture of good governance. I think we need to have this culture of good governance to share experiences and to support business governments to adopting the international norms and the standards in the ASEAN work plans. All the ASEAN work plans have got good documentation, good plans, good objectives, but it is not realized. And to do that, we also think we should connect businesses with the sectorial bodies and to move forward. So where are we now? We have about 60 companies signed up. But when we approached this slowly, we found that actually there is a lot of small companies in ASEAN who are very value driven. They are businesses who talks about business owners with a conscience to go and operate more than just profitability. But we have done this survey among them. They want to have the branding, and they also want help to really grow as an organization responsible, inclusive, look at impact funding, and use the ASEAN platform so we can all raise the standards up. And we have some activities, but going forward, I think to really do, the bigger companies in ASEAN should come forward. I think since we're talking to the Japanese companies, when the ASEAN CSR, we had good contacts and good relations with some Japanese companies, but the Japanese government initiated with us, but today they are not a party to many of these developments. And I think from our governments to all of them say they support all these things, but I think we also cannot ignore there is this whole global drive and regional trends. COVID-19 has exposed the need for responsible business. So the other thing we suggested was having research, and some of the areas that is covered, I will cover more later in these things. So, and I want to finally say that businesses have actually come up with this document called Pathway, ASEAN Business Advisory Council, with all these ASEAN businesses. We made these recommendations to 225 recommendations. In these recommendations to address COVID, there's a strong recommendation to have a high-level steering commission to get things moving faster in ASEAN, decision-making faster, and also that the way forward is to look at responsible business conduct, human rights, and to treat people fairly, look at address challenges of climate change and people. And I think this is still not really acted on yet, and I know that my colleagues in the ASEAN Business Advisory Council is pushing this agenda very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Thank you for the very, very critical presentation and assessments on what more needs to be done by businesses as well as governments in promoting responsible business conduct and practices in the region. But also thank you for highlighting the issues about collaboration, which I think was reiterated by Dr. Young as well, mentioned by Dr. Young as well, and how can businesses engage with governments even more? And I think you have listed down some recommendations and observations. We move on to Ms. Miwa Yamada. Yamada-san, the floor is yours, please.
Hi, thank you very much for kind introduction, Ben. Can you hear me? Okay. My presentation title is Opportunities and Challenges in Engaging with Japanese Companies on Responsible Business in Southeast Asia. This is really a challenging title, which is assigned by our tactful moderator, Ben. Well, thank you very much. So my talk is addressed to Japanese companies as well as their business partners, and also stakeholders in the government as a whole. At the beginning, I would like to share some results from our survey, which collected answers from 814 Japanese companies operating overseas. Among them, 557 companies are in Southeast Asia. As we have been discussing throughout this webinar series, responsible business issues range from labor, human rights, environment, to information disclosure and corruption and tax payment. The survey shows Japanese companies' concerns are different issue by issue. For example, while almost 90% of the companies answered their workers' health is of their concern, but business in conflict area is concerned by less than 30% of the respondents in the survey. Let us focus the answers from Japanese companies in Southeast Asia. 25.9% of the respondents have concerns on specific human rights risks arising in their operations or in the relationship with their business partners. This percentage is lower than the answers from Japanese companies located in other regions, but we all know it doesn't really mean that Southeast Asia has lowest human rights risks. Concrete examples given by the respondents include various issues such as labor, suppliers, race, religion, ethnicity related, business operations, and laws and regulations in host countries. Among these issues, corruption is the highest concern of the Japanese companies. Then, what are the opportunities and challenges for the Japanese companies in Southeast Asia? First, Japanese companies need to widen the scope of responsible business practice. The survey shows Japanese companies in this region tend to rely on local laws and regulations only. Of course, compliance with local laws and regulations is a first primacy, but these laws and regulations do not necessarily provide enough for the companies to meet the expectation of stakeholders, meet the expectation of what the stakeholders think what is responsible business. So second, Japanese companies need more engagement with multi-stakeholders. In the survey, only 15.6% of the respondents have collaborated with stakeholders. Companies will gain more inputs by engaging with more stakeholders. Here is the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, which will be helpful for business and stakeholders. I just want to say that the IDE JETRO contributed to the Japanese version of this guidance, so I recommend the Japanese companies to make use of it. Then we come back to our fundamental question. What is responsible business for? Why do we need this? Many of you have heard of this EU-funded project, which is titled Responsible Supply Chains in Asia. We, IDE JETRO, has been working with them in some research. This project targets 2 industries in each 6 countries. The rationale behind this project is what EU explains. These countries are their important key trading partners. Of course, for these countries, including Japan, EU is also an important trading partner. I hope this project has generated positive outcome in many parts. But what I would like to stress here is responsible business is not for trading partners only, but for ourselves. As described in the background of this webinar, as Ben explained, responsible business for this region's sustainable, long-term, and inclusive growth, accountability, transparency, rule of law. These are underlying elements to realize responsible business practice. The society where human rights, labor, and environment are protected is a sound market for business as well. So we can say vice versa. Then, what are the roles for Japanese companies to play in the region? As we've seen, they are very diligent in compliance with local laws and regulation. And what the Japanese company can do more is to improve business transparency and accountability in their business operation, even if local laws and regulations do not require to that extent. Good corporate governance, constructive labor management relationship, and sustainable finance. These are what the Japanese companies can share with their business partners in this region. So in doing so, Japanese companies need more further engagement with more multi-stakeholders in the region. Lastly, what roles should government play? Government's role is most of all to create enabling environment for business to practice responsible business. Especially governments should address systemic risks which individual companies cannot mitigate or prevent by themselves. Those could be issues of corruption, child labor, or migrant workers recruitment system. And cooperation among governments is essential. As we all know, last year, Thailand launched National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So in order to implement the plan, Thailand needs collaboration with multi-stakeholders, which certainly include Japanese companies. Also, the Japanese government is drafting National Action Plan and supposed to launch this year. So for the Japanese side as well, cooperation with host countries, as Thomas says, companies and countries in ASEAN is imperative to promote responsible business practice by Japanese companies in the region. We hope they will produce sort of a synergistic effects in the region. Last but not least, space for civil society has to be secured for meaningful engagement. Where the space for civil society is limited, it is difficult for companies to practice responsible business. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yamada-san, for a very, very insightful presentation that tells us about the different dimensions, really, about responsible business, which can incorporate not just human rights, but also, information disclosures and various other issues. But I think one of the key takeaways from your presentation, Yamada-san, is there is currently a disjointed reality between what Japanese companies need to comply with locally in the countries that they're operating in, and also at the same time the instruments and international standards that are, I think, more useful and would need some level of paying attention to, but that is actually in conflict with local realities. So maybe I can engage you on that a little further during the panel discussion, but that was certainly a very, very important takeaway. We are going to now move on to Mr. Lowell Chow. Lowell, the floor is yours. Lowell, you need to unmute yourself.
Thanks very much, Ben. I hope you can all see my screen. Hi, everyone. Thanks to the Institute and Sasakawa Peace Foundation for hosting this event. So Yamada-san has already touched on the impact of Japanese companies in the Southeast Asia region. So it would be great if we can now move on to look at the Chinese companies in the region and perhaps see if there are actually any lessons learned from them. And see how they are behaving differently comparing to Japanese companies. So please allow me to talk a little bit about our work at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, because it's quite relevant to what we are discussing today. So we are basically an online information hub. We compile news about positive and negative impact of human rights impact of companies worldwide. We cover more than 10,000 companies already on our website. There are more than 120,000 items on our website. And we do this with our very wide coverage of our staff members in the globe. We have 3 colleagues in Southeast Asia and 2 colleagues for Japan, so that we network with the local partners, including CSOs and companies or even governments, to understand the situation on the ground. And that's how we are collecting information to put on our website. And with the support by Sasakawa Peace Foundation, we have recently launched our Japanese website. The URL is on the screen, so you can visit the website if you wish. We also have a monthly newsletter in Japanese to talk about the recent trends globally in Japanese language. And we also translate materials between Japanese and English so that people also understand what's happening in terms of business and human rights in Japan and the rest of the region as well. Apart from our website, which is our work on transparency, we also work on accountability. When there are major allegations related to business conduct in different regions, we seek company responses directly from the companies. For example, you can see on the screen that there are a number of companies that we have sought responses from. That includes quite a few Japanese companies. For example, we have secured responses from Tokyo Takemono and banks like Mizuho Ginko that about their operations related to Myanmar. This is a way that we seek for accountability when there are issues relating to business conducts. We use this mechanism to ensure that there is accountability so that when there are allegations, it becomes visible on our website, and we also present the version of the story by the companies as well. So I'm gonna talk about Chinese investments in the regions. So you would probably have already heard about the Belt and Road Initiative. Basically, it's China's global infrastructure development strategy, and it significantly increases the investments of Chinese companies in in all regions, including Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, and so on. And there are major projects, including in the mining industry, road building, and the energy sector as well. And with these projects, many of them are mega projects. There comes a lot of issues related to human rights as well. That includes environmental degradation and effects on people's livelihood, specifically. And to address this, we also built our portal website on Chinese investment overseas, and we have our quarterly newsletter on Chinese responsible investment overseas as well, which you can also subscribe for free on our website. I would just basically touch on two findings from our work related to transparency and accountability. Regarding accountability, as I mentioned earlier, we seek company responses from companies when there are major allegations. We do the same towards Chinese companies operating overseas as well. So as you can see on the screen, the response rates from the Chinese companies are significantly lower than our global response rate. Our global response rate is above 70%, but for Chinese companies, it's about 25%. I'm usually the person who approaches the Chinese companies, and what happens when we approach the Chinese companies is that they are very opaque. They do not have contact details for anyone who is in charge of responding to public inquiries. And when there are issues related to human rights or environmental degradation, it's very, very difficult to for civil society or the affected communities to approach the companies. We have done this many, many times. We still find it difficult towards Chinese companies. Imagine how much more difficult it would be for the affected communities and other CSOs. The other thing regarding transparency, which is a theme that other speakers have already touched upon, we have this Know the Chain benchmark, which is a benchmark on companies related to their policies and practices when addressing forced labor issues in their supply chains. And we have done this on 3 sectors, the information technology sector, the food and beverage sector, and apparel and footwear sector. We have done this for 3 years, now, and for our findings, we have done this globally, but in this screen, I am just picking out the Asian companies. And you can see from this chart, Chinese companies are really lagging behind. And this is for a scale from 0 to 100. So the maximum score is 100. And you can see Japanese and Korean companies and maybe Taiwanese companies, they tend to score significantly higher in this chart, and the bottom, including 5-0 scored companies, three of them are from China, and yeah, this is quite a disappointing finding from us. So I think Chinese companies would definitely have to improve on their transparency, because in this benchmark, we are looking at transparency mainly. I'll just quickly talk about one case that I have witnessed by my own eyes. It's related to Myanmar-China pipeline that was developed by China National Petroleum Corporation, the CNPC, and a local Myanmar company. So there were allegations related to land compensation, safety, and the construction of the pipeline. We have sought a response from CNPC. They, after numerous attempts, they sent us this response, which was 7 pages long. We were quite encouraged when we received this in 2015. But then after a few years, we have went to Myanmar to look at the impact of this pipeline. There are still a lot of unaddressed issues. For example, in the first picture in the screen, you can see cemented land that was originally farmers' farmland. And in the second picture, you can see water from the river being diverted into directions where they shouldn't be, so the farmers can no longer use them to water their plants. In the first picture in the screen, it's a community with their cemetery removed, so they don't know where the dead bodies of their ancestors are anymore, and these are all because of the project and the lack of free prior informed consent beforehand. So yeah, this is another aspect that Chinese companies may have to improve. There are actually a lot of guidelines published by official parties or government-affiliated parties, business associations in China to promote responsible businesses for Chinese companies. But as the UN expert on the effects of foreign debt on human rights said in his visit in 2015, a lot of these guidelines are weak, very weak on implementation, and particularly on remedies and grievance mechanisms. He recommended Chinese companies and the Chinese government to improve on those. And although this report was written in 2015, when we look at the problem now, 5 years later, I think this is still very much the same. So yes, that's the end of my presentation. And I just wanted to say that there are proactive actions that companies both from China and the rest of the world should take, for example, free prior informed consent. And there are reactive actions like building up their grievance mechanisms when they invest in certain country. That's now I'm going to hand over back to Ben.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chow, for that presentation, and also to highlighting the difficulty in engaging with Chinese companies on responsible business. I'm just wondering if what are the appropriate platforms and opportunities that can come into the picture actually to engage with these companies, and perhaps you can explore that later. And I think a second question would be what are the appropriate topics and issues that we can actually engage and communicate to Chinese companies. I think this is quite important given that China's presence is really major and in Southeast Asia, and I think this is something that we can explore later. We move on to Mr. Hirokazu Kobayashi. Kobayashi-san, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Benjamin-san, and very good morning to everyone. It's my great pleasure to take part in this webinar. Today, taking this opportunity, I would like to share my view about what sort of consideration is important when you think about responsible business with regard to climate change and decarbonization, particularly in Southeast Asia. Please let me share my slides. I have been involved in energy policy and environmental policy for many years when I was in Japan with METI, and I am currently in a position to support various activities of Japanese companies in Southeast Asia. So my comments and views today are based on such experience and background. But just a gentle reminder, please understand that what I am going to talk today is my personal view and does not represent the organization to which I belong. Before talking about the decarbonization and climate change, let me begin by sharing you a very brief observation on the growing awareness among the business sector in Japan about SDGs. In the past time, when people talked about ethics in business and social responsibility of business, it was often the case that they treated such concepts and ideas as a kind of obligation and burden rather than positive opportunity for value creation. In recent years, by contrast, a large number of companies begin to put high priority on SDGs as a fundamental management consideration in shaping their corporate governance and corporate growth strategy. METI Japan has played the role of an advocate and a navigator by producing a number of reports and guidelines to raise wider awareness of the positive interaction between active consideration of SDGs and better corporate performance. One example of those guidelines is the Guide for SDG Business Management, published last year, which aimed to encourage companies to incorporate the SDGs into their business and investors to evaluate companies' competitiveness appropriately. This guideline was shared with G20 member countries at the ministerial meeting held in Japan last year, and highly appreciated as a good policy example. I think this illustrates how much the SDGs are treated as central agenda for economic policy and business management. As we have seen, overall momentum in the Japanese business community about social responsibility is high and even higher than before. And the government has taken continuous engagement to encourage them. However, having said that, for some sectors where mid to long-term investment is indispensable and where the government regulation is critical in shaping the business environment, it is essential to provide a proper policy framework. And the energy sector is a typical case. This slide shows you multiple steps which I think are necessary to take for most of the world towards decarbonization, while simultaneously achieving other social development goals, which include ending poverty, creating better jobs, providing proper industrial foundation, and so on. It is needless to say that climate change is one of the biggest common challenges across the world, and according to the ISEAS survey, it is widely considered as such also in this region and in Southeast Asia. At the same time, energy demand is continuously increasing, and ensuring good access to affordable energy is also essential in achieving other social development goals with high political priority. In this big picture, the most important concept, I believe, here is the transition. and I noticed growing interest in it, especially in Asia, including Southeast Asia. Leapfrogging is ideal, but in the real world, you cannot expect it for all sectors and all regions. While developed countries may be ready to move on to the stage of decarbonization with advanced technologies, such as renewable energy, it does not mean all countries could immediately follow the same path. The policy framework must be well elaborated by fully taking into account the level of development and affordability, as well as other social challenges in each country. By doing so, we are able to navigate business sector so that they can fulfill their potential to the maximum. A huge amount of investment is needed for low carbonization and decarbonization, particularly in emerging countries, including those in Southeast Asia. Business sector must play a big role. It is the business sector who can provide clean technology, which are already at the implementation stage, and simultaneously develop innovation to drastically reduce greenhouse gases. I'd like to finish my presentation by briefly introducing the report just published last month by METI Japan. The title of the report is Climate Innovation Finance Strategy, and the full report is available in the website. This slide just shows you a conceptual outline of the report. The key message is very simple. It's TGIF. It means in order to achieve SDGs and the objectives in the Paris Agreement for climate change, it is important to simultaneously promote transition, T, green, G, and innovation, I, and to finance, F, for all those projects, rather than taking a binary approach to green or non-green. The importance of transition is highlighted here, and the report said that it's especially the case in emerging Asian economies. I don't think I have enough time to go into details, but what I want to emphasize here is the importance of materializing and reshaping the concept of SDGs and ESG in the light of Asian reality, and then proactively representing it to the rest of the world. I believe we can make collective efforts among Asian countries. That's all from me, and I will stop talking here so that we can move on to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kobayashi-san. Thank you very much for outlining the climate innovation finance strategy of METI, as well as giving us the important key takeaways from your presentation would be the huge amount of investments that are needed for decarbonization, especially in emerging Southeast Asian economies. And there is certainly room for the business sector to step in to address climate change and lead innovations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Also, I think you have also mentioned an interesting point, which hopefully we have time to pick up later, is how can we actually reshape ESG and SDGs the Asian way. So that is something that probably if we have time, we can explore that and debate that a little. So thank you to our 5 speakers for giving us the very insightful and critical presentations. And for our audience over the World Wide Web, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your questions. We will collect the questions from now till the end of the webinar. At the meantime, while you're thinking about your questions, let me start asking the first question to our panel of speakers. This is about COVID-19 during this time for responsible business. And I think even before COVID-19, we have been thinking a lot about the future of work. And now with all these consequences of the pandemic, that thinking has accelerated even more with the huge numbers of unemployment and loss of livelihoods. If I can direct this question to our panel of speakers, perhaps starting with Dr. Yang, how do you see the evolution of work into the future? Dr. Yang.
Thank you, Ben. I think in terms of ASEAN Foundation's perspective, we are looking at three things that the youth or worker wanted to achieve is to look into Industry 4.0. Because it's actually three things they need to do now is to equip themselves with digital skill and engage in the virtual world and be flexible and adaptable. So in fact, Ben, you can actually find the most top skills that needed from some of these research social media platform, just like LinkedIn. They mentioned that top 5 soft skills that needed is creativity, persuasions, collaborations, adaptability, and emotional intelligence. And top 10 hard skills will be blockchain, cloud computing, analytical reasoning, artificial intelligence, UX design, business analysis, affiliate marketing, sales, scientific computing, and video production. I mean, a lot of people will ask why video production, because everything that you want to do now, you have to be in the social media. So without that skill, without that kind of complementary skill, I would just say, so that is where the cultural and arts and media sides come in. That's why we do, now we are currently in discussion with, one is with German government, and another one is with a social media platform to create a upskill and reskill platform to train the people, like especially from tourism sectors, we identify as one of the most affected industry, to reskill them so that they can find work in different sectors. So, and also to upskill, and also apart from reskill and upskill, to connect them to the jobs. Because I think that gaps has always been there, even before COVID-19. So now the more is needed to actually collaborate with the corporate world to have this matching, and then also matching and selecting the best candidates for them. Because now I think the next biggest challenge for corporate is actually to look for the best candidate to work. Because there will be different types of working model right now. But for ASEAN Foundation itself, I think even after COVID, post-COVID-19, we were going to have maybe 2 types of working environment, which is combined with the work from home and also going to the office. So I think things will be really different from now on. And secondly is to also encourage enterprising. We wanted young people also to consider creating jobs instead of hunting for jobs. It means that you become social enterprise. So we encourage a lot of social enterprising setup, but how to do it is the biggest challenge. And we work with the German government, I mean, thanks to their for support, to actually train youth to be their own boss, to create business opportunity for others to actually apply for jobs and recruitment and all that. So that is more or less. And also one interesting fact is I think everybody is concerned over is the impact survey by ASEAN Secretariat mentioned that 71 million will be living in poverty, and then 100 million living in extreme poverty. So you can imagine, and those that in the rural area and the poor one, the marginalized one, will be more badly affected compared to the city folks and people which is elite group. So the one that already left behind will be further left behind. So I think this is something that we really need to look into, especially to reach out to this group, because first of all, infrastructure is an issue, digital divide is an issue. So there is many kind of ecosystem needs to be put up. Apart from retrain and reskill, that is only for the group of people, because in 2018 there is a research done for ASEAN. Internet access is only 54% is able to access to the internet. And but of course, some of the business community is really positive over ASEAN as a next biggest market for e-commerce, because according to the estimate is 480 million people in the whole ASEAN region will have access to internet. So that is a different kind of perspective looking at. So e-commerce and all that, digital kind of platform will be the future way to drive future skills jobs.
Okay, so essentially it's reskill. You have to match the people to the jobs, and also the promotion of social entrepreneurship, which really requires a multi-stakeholder approach from government, other sectors, and
because instead of fighting and looking for the same job, everyone, because my concern is if we keep on pushing Industry 4.0 and keep on pushing science and technology, STI, and in future you will have oversupply of this group, and then you have less supply in other sectors.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in Mr. Thomas now for his perspective, especially with his engagement with various stakeholders in the world of work in Southeast Asia. Mr. Thomas, what are your views on this?
I think the first and foremost point I want to make is that when we talk about future of work, is change. And change has been a constant all over time. Jobs change because technology change, social dimensions change. Jobs that exist today will not exist tomorrow. It has always been. So it's a management of change that we're talking about. And in management of change, in the ASEAN document on social responsibility, guidelines on CSR on labor, they actually talked very much on a priority area called human resource development and training, where we ask establishments to pursue human resource development policies and programs that provide the relevant training and lifelong learning opportunities for all levels of employees to develop their skills and promote career opportunities. One of the things is the employees must have this continuous learning, that they will want to stay in the organization, but is not afraid to leave because their skills and opportunities are available elsewhere. And I think one of the key part is in management change is to give voice to all the stakeholders. So one of the weakness that we have and COVID come out very clearly is our own perceptions and society's perceptions of who has been essential and who has not been essential. When we have these lockdowns, our hedge fund managers were not considered essential, but the cleaners and the hospital staff, they were essential. And our transport workers have been essential. But in a normal economy, we have been undervalued. So I think in this COVID and the future of work is to value people more and give people at least a living wage so they can move from jobs. I also want to say that one of the ways, the best way is to engage everybody. So we will have to talk about engaging worker representatives, trade unions, civil societies. And one of the weaknesses that I found over the years, ASEAN, is that we actually seems to be a lot of our businesses are government owned and very good connections with government. So they tend to ignore other voices that is unpleasant to hear until they can't control. So we also need to strengthen our worker representative trade unions around here and also talk about local civil society. Many of the civil society that's driving the agenda in ASEAN are international civil societies. And we need to get that ASEAN. And one of the things that I'm struggling with ASEAN CSR Network Ariba is to have a real ASEAN way of looking at SDGs, ESGs and all. Because if you look at real companies, I want to say there are companies that come out and broadcast how wonderful they are, but you find that many of our studies in sustainable development or sustainable reporting, they are very strong in environment, but does not talk very much about people management and human rights. And we will have to do more on that and sustainable development goals. On the other hand, we also have very small companies, a lot of them, who implicitly doesn't talk anything, but actually does it in practice, looking after people and involving people. And I think we should do And that, I think, is the real Asian way of doing things.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. I think there is a lot of common ground amongst the panel of speakers today. You're talking about, there needs to be an ASEAN version, Asian version of CSR. And then Kobayashi-san, he's saying that, CSR and SDGs, it really needs to have an Asian focus, as well. And Miwa-san, Yamada-san, sorry, she talked about the various needs and considerations of Japanese companies in addressing the SDGs. And it's not just about looking at local, but also reinterpreting and factoring in the global as well. Now, can I engage all of you a bit further on this front? What do you mean by, an Asian CSR, an Asian version of ESG indices or investment portfolios? And how do you see these priorities, surfacing to become more prominent rather than what the international community is advocating for ESG and sustainability agendas? Perhaps we could start with Miwa-san. I believe you have something to say about this. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, Ben. It's quite exciting to talk about, Asian version or ASEAN version of CSR or Asian version of ESG, but we have to be clear about, the universal value of, what human rights are and what are the, transparency and accountability are. So maybe we share the same value, but the approach could be different. In the context of background where you operate and whom you are engaging. So, but in a sense, broadly, I am a Japanese, and then I feel that something which is concept, human rights concept is coming from overseas, and it's not originally given a birth from our region, but come on. This is the 21st century. We owe the human rights. We were also the Human Rights Council members when the UNGP was signed in 2011. So we are not in a position. We all are not in a position to create something different from what we have been shared for a long time. So what I wanted to say is Japanese companies are very much, diligent, and working hard in compliance with local laws and regulations. But, what the companies are doing in the region is not doing the business, towards the government itself. So we have multi-stakeholders. So when, Lowell said that, FPIC, free prior informed consent, this concept, this is not really shared by, in Asian country, maybe somewhere and even in Japan. So, this concept is very, very important. So even though it is not written in laws and regulations in the local context, this is the time for us to, integrate this concept, in their responsible business. So, sorry, I'm agreeing with, translating or interpreting or creating Asian something, but, we should not forget, what its universal value is. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Miwa-san, for highlighting that there is also a place for universal values of human rights, and the guiding principles. And there needs to be a framework in place side by side with the considerations of what local conditions and context may mean for CSR and environmental, social, and governance criteria. Yes.
May I add a little bit about this? I really agreeable with Dr. Yamada, because for me it's like we don't have to do things start from zero. We are global citizen. but we can do it. We can have a different approach, because for ASEAN Foundation, also for ASEAN Secretariat, we do have a CSO network, and we have more than 400 to 500 CSO network. So right now, it is more important to work with CSO and local community. So we notice when we work with the CSO, because we can't travel anymore, just admit that we can't meet people on our own. So we work with CSO all the time. So all the funds we get from any of the partners or corporate, we will have to share with the CSO, because they will be our linkage to the community. So we found out that the biggest challenge we have right now is the requirements and the standard being set by the global is very high in terms of responsible, in terms of accountability, in terms of reportings and all that. It's really very difficult for local CSO to achieve. So we actually downsize it and do it more, simplify it. We simplify the process actually. So I think that I do hope that some of the corporate are here, especially the global corporate who wants to support ASEAN-based kind of projects or any Asia-based kind of project. Please consider some sort of like customizations of processing. Yeah, that is my advice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Yang. Can I also carry on from your train of thought and come to Lowell? Lowell, you were mentioning that this is really very, very difficult to engage with Chinese companies on responsible business practices and the kinds of discourses that we have, from on ESG, on sustainability, on human rights. Lowell, are there any other topics or platforms that perhaps are more suited to engaging with Chinese companies on responsible business? Are we talking to a hard wall? And are there any ways around it? Lowell, your thoughts, please.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I can answer that question adding up to what Yamada-san has just mentioned related to the Asian version of CSR. I very much agree that we should approach CSR in a different way in Asia, but we shouldn't give up the universal definition on what human rights should be, and that should be the approach that we take. And as a matter of fact, as CSR has evolved over the past 2 or 3 decades, in Asia, it's still very much seen as a philanthropic thing instead of a human rights-based thing. So I think that is something that we should keep in mind, and for us all who are involved to bear that in mind in what we see as CSR, and to approach it differently in Asia's context. Regarding Chinese companies, I have seen questions related to that in the Q&A box. So for Chinese companies, it's, as I mentioned in my slides, it's quite difficult to approach them, but it's not completely impossible. For example, there are Chinese CSOs that have, let's say, they kind of do their work in China as consultant entities. So they are being commissioned by Chinese companies to work on CSR when they invest overseas. So as consultants, they provide professional opinions to the Chinese companies to improve on their practices on the ground. In the host countries, they would act as CSOs to understand the issues on the ground, and, for example, network with the Southeast Asian CSOs or organizations from elsewhere to understand the issues, so that they can use this channel to let the Chinese company's management know that there are actually problems in your operations, you should do A, B, C, and D to address these issues. There are ways like this that we can possibly use. So in the recent years, we really see the importance of linking up the Chinese CSOs or the Chinese consultants, CSR consultants, with the host country CSOs. That's one way of the approach that we can take when addressing the human rights issues related to Chinese projects. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here first.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Lowell. Now, we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and I don't want to not include them. We have. Let me highlight two questions. The first is from Casey Lee from ISEAS. The informal sector is large in many ASEAN countries. Can the panelists shed light on responsible business practices concerning this sector? And what policy initiatives have been implemented to address the issue? And following up on that, a question to Yamada-san from Coleman Lambo, no organization was specified. You mentioned that only 15.6% of Japanese companies collaborate with stakeholders. Which specific stakeholders do Japanese companies need to engage more with, and how can this be encouraged? Yeah, so perhaps we could start with Casey's question on the informal sector and what business practices have been addressed and can we see emerging to address this sector. Perhaps I can direct this question to Mr. Thomas first. Sorry, it's I have to bring up my... Mr. Thomas, you need to unmute yourself.
I would say first and foremost, the informal sector in ASEAN has been a very serious issue. Because the informal sector does not get many of the social securities and other things. So in 2016, I think the ASEAN labor ministers have made a declaration that they want to move the informal sector to the formal sector. But today they are also, since making the declaration 5 years ago, they have huge new informal sectors coming up. I mean, for example, the transport Grab drivers and the delivery, and so the informal sector has been. So the question is, how do we bring them in and do? One of the reasons why you have high informal sector and we need to address is the drive to cut down costs. And so I think we need, that's where responsible business comes out, that you don't, and I think we should also have a responsible buying code, that you don't buy necessarily from the cheapest until people have to work for starvation wages and in order to profit a few. So I think the values of responsible business, of treating people in the informal sector with dignity, with respect, giving them a living wage, paying on time for services, and not undercutting for the whole lot will make a tremendous difference. And I think we should also look at the question and the values of outsourcing. Outsourcing for many organizations is cheap sourcing and moving people to the informal sector. So I think the responsible businesses will definitely say, yes, there is a value. I want to have cheap, but you make sure your people is paid at least a living wage.
Yes.
And that's the responsibility.
To even engage them even more.
Yeah.
Yes. And how about Yamada?
I think we just, sorry, and I think one of the points that I think we should also change our laws to make it more easier for these workers to join trade unions and get representation and have a collective voice. Because without that collective voice, it's very hard to get decent terms and conditions.
Thank you for that recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Yamada-san, how about the question on which stakeholders should Japanese companies engage more with, and how can that be encouraged?
Thank you for the question from Coleman-san. sorry, I do not have the specific figures at hand at this moment, but the stakeholders, mostly the Japanese companies, are engaged with local community and also the local government and other business sector and university and the institutions. And they need to engage more with local NGOs and international NGOs as well. And from my experience, because I've been working in this field and sometimes I've been contacted by Japanese companies and then they are asking me, do you know this organization, working in, let's say Myanmar or somewhere, and then is it okay to be contacted with them, or, how can we, communicate with them? So one of the things that, what we have to make sure that, companies is informed, the companies learned from, engagement with more multi-stakeholders. So let's getting back to the local laws and regulation. If it doesn't say that, we need to engage with, local NGO, international NGOs, for the, company itself, they will not be aware of it until the time, their doors is knocked by, someone, from outside. So, but, through this, seminar series, and then I think, maybe for the Japanese, most of the Japanese companies, they're becoming aware of the significance or importance of, engaging with, more stakeholders.
All right. Thank you, Yamada-san. Thank you for your take on the multi-stakeholder relationships and the collaborations that will be needed. I'm very mindful of the time, and I would like to ask just one last question. If I can ask all our speakers to give a 1-sentence to 2-sentence answer. And now it is very easy to focus on the negatives and the challenges during this COVID-19 pandemic. As we think about all these challenges, what are the things or issues that makes you optimistic? What do you hope for the future of responsible business, in other words? Dr. Yang.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Okay, 2 or 3 words. I just say that with the digital world, you want to do something is so easy right now. You can reach your people without thinking about too much of cost and all that effort, planning. If you want to do it, you just can plan in like 1-2 weeks, then you can implement it immediately if you are serious about it. So for me, the opportunity is there, the speed is there. And then for people who has been affected with their studies and their life and their work, just look at the positive side is you still have some work to do. You still can learn something from using digital platform. It's not that the world is totally stopped. It's time for you to do planning for me. So this is a good time to do planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. Kobayashi. Kobayashi-san.
Hi, thank you very much. I would like to touch upon the growing community of startups, which we haven't talked about in this session, but it's definitely a very promising trend, particularly in this region. And the younger generations are very much keen to participate in that community and to bring the good benefit to solve the social agenda. That is a very distinctive trend in this region. So not only focusing on the large companies, traditional companies, by looking at the startups and younger generation, we could be much more encouraged in this context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kobayashi-san. And Lowell, Chow, what makes you optimistic about the field of responsible business?
Yes, we launched our COVID-19 apparel action tracker a couple of months ago, and we asked major brands questions on their actions responding to the COVID-19 crisis. And about 2/3 of them among the 35 more aggressive businesses being surveyed, 2/3 of them said that they would honor the contracts that and they will pay for the orders that have been already produced by the factories. They have been saying they will support suppliers to access finance when they are in financial difficulties, and they have suspended shareholders' dividends so that they can reserve more money to pay for the factory orders. I think at this time, there are brands that are coming out and say that we're gonna support the factories and in turn support the workers. I think it's very important, and I hope that there will be more brands and other companies that will do a bit more to keep the workers' rights in mind, and I'm quite hopeful for that too.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chow. Yamada-san, very briefly, what do you hope for the future of responsible business?
Oh, it is nice to have this kind of webinar series, and also we can foresee the collaboration among governments and multi-stakeholders and companies and civil society groups themselves. So what we can be optimistic and happy about this having the COVID-19 crisis, we realize we are on the same boat to for the realization of human responsible business. Thank you.
Thank you, Yamada-san, and finally, Mr. Thomas.
Thanks. I would say that actually I'm quite optimistic about the future. On one hand, there are a lot of things to give you doom and gloom. And there are factors that also work against it. For example, one of the biggest hurdles to have an ASEAN standard is the ASEAN consensus, which might end up with the lowest common denominator and dropping up. So that's one of the reasons why the ASEAN CSR network, when we do it, we say it's global standards, but let's implement it along the way to the ASEAN way. And one of the greatest things of education I find very encouraging is that there are a lot of small new entrepreneurs in ASEAN who wants to do it right and very conscious about the society as a whole and not just at profit maximization. I mean, they have to make profit in order to exist, but they also want to make a contribution to the society at large and pay people a decent, helping refugees, etc., in small, modest ways. I hope, what I really think that the way to go forward is for more of these companies who are and organizations to come forward and be champions. We need more champions. And the more champions comes, they set the trailblazing and people will follow. And this would be the norms and the unwritten norms within the whole society as a whole. So that's my ambition. And anybody who wants to be a champion, please contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Thank you. No, I'm sorry we have run out of time. I wish we could discuss this longer. I would like to thank our 5 speakers for their presentations and answers, and also to our audience over the World Wide Web for joining us this morning. In closing, I would like to acknowledge the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for their collaboration and support in this series of discussions under the banner of the Asia Impact Dialogue. Their support reflects Japan's deep and enduring relationship with Singapore and Southeast Asia, and we can expect to see more of such joint activities that examines the common social issues affecting Japan and Southeast Asia and the practical solutions that can emerge to solve these issues. We look forward, everyone, to connecting with you on our future joint webinars and other activities. And at the meantime, please take care and have a pleasant day ahead. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Arigato.
Bye.
Bye.